Okay, now let's turn to our second segment for tonight. This weekend begins the college football playoff. Now, before we get to that, there certainly are credible arguments that you could make regarding the college football playoff and the teams that were selected. I, for one, do not think the best 12 teams were selected. I think that the best 12 teams should have been selected, and that the sole goal of the college football playoff should be to select the top 12 teams. Now, the top 12 teams may not be a conference champion. Okay? It may not be a team with just one loss. You have to look beyond a conference championship and beyond a record to really search for who are those 12 best teams. In my view, the committee did a pretty good job. I'd give them a B. But I think they could have done better. Why do I say that? Because I'm not so sure Clemson should be in the playoff. I'm not so sure that Boise State should be in. I could name a few other teams, but you get my point. I think that ultimately we did not get the 12 best teams, but we got most of the best teams, so that's okay. And whether that means we're going to expand the playoff in the future, as has been suggested, we'll see. What I would say is if I was picking the teams, there's one team that stands out to me that should have been in the playoff and isn't. South Carolina. South Carolina was on fire at the end of the year. And I know that South Carolina had 3 losses. I know that South Carolina had a few bad losses. But I think if we're looking solely for the best teams, the 12 best teams, we don't just look at record. We don't just look at did you win your conference. You look at strength of schedule also, and you look at the trajectory of the team over the course of the year. And teams that are hot at the end, even though they may have lost earlier, may deserve a spot in the championship game, particularly if a conference champion really isn't a top-notch team, such as perhaps in the Big 12, or a team with a better record is on a downward trajectory at the end of the year. And I think that those considerations should have been important for the committee, and I think South Carolina should have gotten in over Clemson. And another reason I say that South Carolina should have gotten in over Clemson is because Clemson had 3 losses. South Carolina had 3 losses. South Carolina beat Clemson head-to-head at Clemson. So what logic can you use to say that Clemson should be in over South Carolina when they had the same amount of losses and South Carolina beat them on the road? Here's what I'll say. The only reason that happened is because of the rule that the conference champion is going to get in. That's why that rule is a problem. Another rule that is a problem are these automatic buys in which you get teams. Okay, 4 teams get buys, but you end up having teams that are getting buys that are not ranked in the top 4. That includes Boise State and Arizona State. Now, I'm not trying to knock those teams and say that they can't go deep into the playoffs, but it seems to me that the inclusion of those teams with buys is a problem. And I think we just had some technical difficulty where on the screen a picture of a receiver from the USC Trojans just came up. But if you can hear me, keep listening. So we have 4 first-round games. Number 1, Clemson versus Texas in Austin. Okay. Hold on. Okay, I think we just fixed it. Although we have a little purple here, but that's fine. Clemson versus Texas in Austin, Texas. Who's going to win this game? Well, Texas just came off of a tough loss to Georgia. Okay. Texas has been sort of an enigma this year. A great defense, an outstanding defense, but their offense has sputtered a bit, and they have struggled as they did against Georgia. Clemson, on the other hand, Clemson had a thrilling win over SMU, a last-second field goal. However, Clemson lost to Louisville this year at home. Clemson has 3 losses. Dabo's team, not going to cut it. Texas is going to roll over Clemson, and they're going to roll 34-17. Now, we have the battle for Indiana. The battle for Indiana, Notre Dame, Fighting Irish against the Hoosiers of Indiana. I think everybody in the state of Indiana is going to be watching this game. It reminds me a bit of the movie Hoosiers, when everybody in Indiana was listening to the radio, when that little small school, I believe it was from Milan, Indiana, won on a last-second shot from the legendary Jimmy Chitwood. Who's going to win this game? Notre Dame. You know, Notre Dame is really something that is hard, a team that's hard to figure out, because Notre Dame, if you look at the last, say, 7 to 10 years, whenever they got into the playoff, they pretty much got dominated by the Alabamas and the Clemsons. This year in South Bend, Notre Dame loses to Northern Illinois University at home. Then they run the table against a pretty weak schedule, but end the season against the University of Southern California Trojans. They defeat USC largely on the basis of 2 pick sixes in the last few minutes of the game. But in that USC game, we saw USC's quarterback, Jade Maava, who was the backup for most of the year, really torched that Notre Dame secondary. And if it wasn't for those 2 pick sixes, they had a chance to win that game, expose some vulnerability on the Notre Dame defense. The Indiana Hoosiers, what a year for the Hoosiers. It really has been something special. Curt Cignetti has done a fantastic job for the Hoosiers. They come in here with 1 loss, a loss 38-15 against the Buckeyes of Ohio State and Columbus, but a loss that was closer than the score indicates, and a loss that was largely the result of uncharacteristic mistakes that the Hoosiers made throughout the game. Indiana's for real. Indiana has a defense. They have a smart coach. They're going to come in with a smart scheme. So who's going to win the game in South Bend? I'm going with the Hoosiers. Upsetting Notre Dame 24-20 in South Bend. So Texas advances. Indiana advances. And then we go to probably the most anticipated game of the weekend, and that is at one of my former alma maters, Ohio State, where I went to law school. Although I'm not an Ohio State fan, they're going to be playing the Volunteers, the SEC team, coming into the Horseshoe. What an intriguing matchup. Well, let's look at Ohio State. Ohio State, $20 million roster. Got Caleb Downs from Alabama, who plays safety. Got Quashon Judkins from Ole Miss, who along with Trayvon Henderson leads a very strong backfield. This Ohio State team is pretty stacked. And on defense, they have one of the top units in the country. But here's the problem. Their offensive line stinks. $20 million, and they have a below-average offensive line. And that has cost them this year, and that cost them against the Wolverines when Michigan's defensive line dominated the Buckeyes in the trenches, and Will Howard looked completely lost against a secondary that played, I think, the game of the year. Michigan's defense shut down an anemic Ohio State offense and showed that if you can get pressure on the quarterback, this game is going to be You're capable of beating Ohio State. What about the Volunteers? Tennessee. Okay. Tennessee has a defense this year. Tennessee has a great running back. But Tennessee has a young quarterback. Nico Maliava. And if I'm pronouncing his last name wrong, I apologize. But he's young. And he's still developing. What does that mean? That means that could spell trouble for the Tennessee offense, especially regarding turnovers. So who wins this game? It's a really tough call. Tennessee's physical. Tennessee is legit. They're fast. They're going to come in hungry. And I'm predicting that Tennessee is going to come in on fire and jump out to a lead on Ohio State in the first half along the lines of 17-7, shutting down the Ohio State offense with pressure from that defensive line. And the offensive line is going to struggle, and it's going to be a domination by Tennessee in the first half. But there's two halves in football. In the second half, Ohio State comes to life, makes just enough plays to win, and Tennessee turns it over late while driving for the winning score, 30-27, Ohio State. In a classic, in a thriller, Ohio State advances. Now, we can't count out. The next game is going to be really exciting because we will be traveling to Happy Valley, Penn State, where Drew Aller, James Franklin, and the Nittany Lions will be taking on an upstart SMU team. I don't know if you all remember the 80s and the Pony Express. We all thought the Pony Express had left the station. Apparently, that is not the case. It is back up and running as SMU comes in with 2 losses and a college football playoff berth in which they edged out Alabama for the 11th seed. And how did that happen? Well, let's look back to the conference championship game. Let's look back to Clemson and SMU. Clemson up 24-7 in the first half. It looked like it was already the end for SMU, not just for the game, but for their playoff hopes. But in the second half, SMU and the Pony Express started rolling. Okay, what we saw from SMU was that they're fast. Their quarterback is talented. They've got some receivers, and they do have a defense. Dominating Clemson for most of that second half, especially in the fourth quarter when they outscored them 17-7. Unfortunately, with 16 seconds left, they give up a long kickoff return, and Clemson's kicker kicks a long field goal as time expires to win the game. But the moral to the story, or the lesson, was that Clemson belongs, and Clemson is legit. Combine that with an Alabama loss on the road against Oklahoma, 3 Jalen Milroe interceptions. Combine that with their loss to Vanderbilt, and SMU edges out Alabama. So they go into Happy Valley, where it's going to be cold, and there's going to be 100,000 people plus wearing white. It's going to be a whiteout. Okay. So conventional wisdom would say Penn State's going to roll. But when I look at Penn State this year, I think Penn State reminds me of every Penn State team I've seen in recent memory. Great defense, especially strong on the edges, but a mediocre offense. An offense that scores just enough to win, as we saw, for example, against Minnesota, as we saw in Happy Valley against Ohio State, when Penn State was up 10-0, scored 3 points for the rest of the game. So, what's going to happen in this game? The Pony Express will keep going and upset Penn State in Happy Valley, 26-20, and SMU will roll into the quarterfinals. So, I've got Texas, Indiana, Ohio State, SMU. Love to hear your comments.